which the Amital Center is a vehicle through which the yeshiva's values and Rav Amital's values can find more precise and wider expression in Israeli society as a whole, and also that those on the outside can come and benefit and enjoy elements of the yeshiva and midrasha for themselves. Should we jump in, Yoel?
Yes, bevakasha.
Okay, lovely. So Rav Tarragon had his grandchildren running around him. I have my children just outside the door. We don't live in a nice big place in Alon Shvut with an office. We live in a small apartment in Tel Aviv, so we feel the tzfifut. I want to share with all of you one of my favorite pieces of Torah for Chanuka. Chanuka presents a challenge to Jewish educators because it doesn't have the normal trappings of text that we look for. There's no Masechet Chanuka in the way in which there is a Masechet Megillah or a Masechet Pesachim, if you want to teach about Purim and Pesach. There's no book of Tanakh. Of course, there is Sefer HaMakkabim, but that was not sanctified. We don't consider it part of our corpus. It doesn't have anything of the tradition or the commentaries nor the familiarity. So what do we teach on Chanuka? So I want to focus on a special text, a text which there is an ancient minhag to read on Chanuka. It is Mizmor Lamed, Tehillim, Psalm number 30. I was actually digging and trying to find the origin of the minhag. In Masechet Sofrim, which is one of the Masechtot Ktanot, which were put together in the time of the Gaonim, we find the following very brief phrase: B'Chanuka aromimcha Hashem. On Chanuka we say, I will praise you Hashem, Tehillim number 30. Slightly later, but early medieval, Sidur 3, Bet Midrash of Rashi, Be'eretz Ha'ai. People know what Eretz Ha'ai is, or Eretz Ha'i? Eretz Ha'i, and you can tell from my accent where I'm from. I always am happy when I come across this. Eretz Ha'i, the land of the island, refers to Britain. That is a medieval rabbinic language for Britain. Doesn't appear very much. There was not that much going on in the world of Torah Shebaal Peh in Britain, so whenever it comes up, that makes me happy. Be'eretz ha'i nohagim lomar b'Chanuka Mizmor shir Chanukat habayit. Sidur 3 in France seems to think that the origin of this minhag of saying Mizmor Lamed on Chanuka comes from Britain. I was going to say the UK. Obviously, it wasn't the UK at the time. The minhag bimkom shir mizmor, in the place of the daily mizmor. Some communities today say it in addition to. So what is the connection? What is the meaning, the relevance of this particular mizmor on Chanuka? Of course, you might think, well, it's just connected to the first pasuk, right? Mizmor shir Chanukat habayit leDavid. It's got the word Chanuka right there in the first pasuk. It's talking about Chanukat habayit, about the dedication of seemingly the Mikdash. Of course, that's a bit confusing, given that it wasn't David who dedicated the temple, but put that to one side. Presumably the connection between why we say the Mizmor on Chanuka is because it's about Chanukat habayit. I want to suggest that actually that is at best a surface connection, and there is a far deeper connection to the story of Chanuka, or the meaning of Chanuka itself. What we're going to do is we're going to do a close reading, relatively quick, but still a pretty close reading of the Mizmor. People should feel free to turn on their screens if they want to. I'm sure people are going around their Sunday morning chores. Even if you're not turning on your screen, feel free to interject and to make it interactive. But let's begin. Let's read. Mizmor shir Chanukat habayit leDavid. Aromimcha Hashem ki dilitani v'lo simachta oivai li. I will praise you. I will like to the heights. I will raise you up. Marom, oh Hashem, ki dilitani, because you have lifted me up. A dili is a bucket, right? A bucket goes into a well, and then it is drawn up out of the well, right? So that is the experience that this individual has had. God, you have drawn me up, and my enemies have not rejoiced over me. Hashem Elokai shivati elecha v'tirpe'eni. I cried out to you, Hashem, and you healed me. Hashem he'elita min she'ol nafshi. God, you raised me up from, it's worth actually being literal with our translations here. The Sefaria translation, I believe it's JPS, just says Sheol. What does Sheol mean? Possibly the grave, possibly the underworld, maybe a more rationalist and a less rationalist translation. Either way, that phrase, Sheol nafshi, I mean, just to translate it is terrifying, right? And Tehillim is actually, can present us with a challenge, because if you take a lot of its language seriously, it's very emotionally intense. You have raised me up from the grave of my soul. You have raised me up from the underworld of my soul. I mean, right, that is darkness, right? God, you've taken me out of there. Chayitani miyardei vor. You have given me life from those that go down to the pit. These three psukim, these three verses, the ones that essentially begin it, all of them share this sort of like common imagery, up and down. A person who has been very low in some dark, seemingly very personal crisis is thanking God for having taken them out of that place. Maybe it's worth a moment before we continue just to spend a moment thinking a little bit about Tehillim as a whole. I remember when I was studying at Gush post-college, and I did classes with Yael Ziegler, and I always like to say that I was a student of Yael before she was famous. I think she'd only very recently got her doctorate at the time, and she taught a course on Tehillim. And I remember her introducing it as follows. She said the following line. She said, Tehillim is the opposite of Tanakh. That was a great, pithy line to capture. What does she mean? Tehillim is the opposite of Tanakh. In Tanakh, God talks to man, talks to humanity as a whole, talks to Am Yisrael, maybe talks to individuals, but it is directed from heaven to earth. Tehillim, by contrast, is humanity talking to Hashem. Right? Humanity in all sorts of different places and moments. Great joy, great sorrow, terror, celebration. But it's the other direction. It is the earth going up to Shamayim. And something very characteristic about Tehillim is that we are almost always denied any particular details, sort of biographical or circumstantial details of what it was that the author who was writing these extremely emotionally charged verses, what it was that led them to write those lines. It's true, sometimes you have an opening verse, David after Bathsheba, that sort of thing, or David Avimelech, but more often than not, in the vast majority of cases, you've got no idea what it is that leads to these things. And part of the reason for this, I think, is that Tehillim is designed to be universal. It's designed to be applicable, that anyone who finds themselves in some extreme emotional state and wishes to speak to Hashem, whether they are terrified or whether they are so grateful or anything else, they can define the Mizmor for them. If we were just to read the stories and have the stories, then it would be harder to put myself into it. But if you look at our example, right, we've got no idea what happened to this person. Why were they in such a place? Why were they in this Sheol Nafshi, this grave of their soul? We don't know. But because we don't know, and because that's not a part of the Tehillim, that's not like an entry requirement into the Mizmor, therefore it's accessible to me as well. It's accessible to anyone who needs it to be. And of course, for this reason, Tehillim really has its unique place when it comes to our religious lives. It's unlike any other book of Tanakh in that it's what we reach for in times of crisis, in times of joy. So let's carry on. Now we are turning to not talking to Hashem, but rather the individual is talking to those around him. Learn from his experience, he says to them. Zamru laHashem chasidav v'hodu lezecher kodsho. Call out to Hashem, sing out to him, his pious ones, give praise. Rega ba'apo chayim birtzono. A moment in his anger is like a life in his goodwill. Be'erev yalim bechi. Maybe this is my favorite line. In the morning, a person lies down. Pardon me. In the evening, a person lies down in tears. But in the morning they can wake up with joy. Right? I mean, we've all had that. Right? I love those 5 words because they capture something which all of us have had. Like sometimes you can go to bed feeling that the world is terrible. But erev yalin bechi, and you can't escape from whatever personal crisis you're in. But la bokerina, it can be turned around, right? You can get up rejoicing as well. But once again, we don't have any inkling, any suggestion as to why it is that this individual had laid down in tears. And everything changes in the next verse. The next verse I want to argue is the key to unlocking the whole. Va'ani amarti b'shalvi. And I said in my serenity, Bal emot olam, I shall never fall. I shall never be shaken. Before we get to the meaning of this verse, how do we know that this verse is significant? Again, people are welcome to unmute themselves and chime in what it is that they hear in this Mizmor. Firstly, this may or may not be significant. It's the middle verse of the whole Mizmor. It stands right in the center. Va'ani amarti b'shalvi ba'al emot olam. It has an equal number of verses before it, equal number after it. Rav Elchanan Samet uses sort of this idea of the middle as a methodological thing throughout his writing. Another thing is that it breaks the rhythm, right? Tehillim normally has this rhythm to it, where sort of verses divide into 2 often, right? Tov lahodot laHashem, ulezam l'shimcha elyon, lahagid baboker chastecha, ve'emunatcha baleilot, right? You can sort of see the same idea reflected on either side. Here, you essentially have just a single line. Ani amarti b'shalvi bal emot olam. And maybe the clearest point here is the word ani. Ani jumps out at us from this pasuk, because even if you've only got a basic knowledge of Hebrew grammar, you'll know that frequently in Hebrew, in the first person singular, the word ani is optional, right? You don't need to say it often because you can assimilate the first person into the verb. So, aromimcha Hashem means I will praise you, Hashem, without the need to use the word ani. Shivati elecha, in the next verse, I cried out to you, does not say ani shivati elecha, because the I, the first person singular, is contained within shivati. That turns it into first person. But here, although it could equally have said amarti b'shalvi, it doesn't. It says va'ani amarti b'shalvi. The I, the ego, this individual, and I hope you're seeing how this grammatical point connects exactly to the content and the meaning of the verse. There was a moment before my fall, before my collapse, says this individual, when I saw myself as totally independent, I saw myself as the sole author of my life and my fate, I did not rely upon anyone else, and I will never fall. That's what I said. And of course, I did fall. The word ani here is critical. Another really interesting word in this pasuk is shalva, shalvi. Right? Ani amarti b'shalvi. Where do we know the word shalva from? No, we sort of think of shalva. Here it says untroubled, serenity. You know, you might think of that as something nice to aspire to. I think there's a really interesting strand of thought that sees shalva as quite a problematic concept. Right? Certainly in this pasuk, right? It's the person's shalva that allows them to say, I don't need any help, not from anyone else, not from Hashem. You might recall the first Rashi on last week's parasha, right? Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz megurei aviv. Yaakov dwelt in the land of his forefathers' wanderings, and you can kind of pick up a bit of a tension in the verse that Yaakov yashav. So it's got a sort of a permanence to it in the land of Megurei Aviv, where his forefathers wandered. His forefathers moved up and down. They had maybe a certain sort of like lack of permanency, or in a certain sense, lack of comfort. Yaakov was Vayeshev. Rashi quotes the Midrash. Now, this is one of the hardest Midrashim I know. It's a very painful Midrash to read, but it's worth thinking about in our context. Bikesh Yaakov lashevet b'shalva. Yaakov desired to dwell in serenity. He'd had a hard life, a life on the road, a life of struggle with his brother, with his father-in-law, with his wives. Now he wants to come back to Eretz Yisrael and retire. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says Hashem, Ani noten letzadikim olam haba v'atam mevakesh gam olam hazeh. Do I not give the righteous the world to come, and you want this world as well? Miyad kafatz rogzo shel Yosef. Immediately the anger of Yosef emerged, came out of it. Just a side point, but fascinating idea that clearly that idea of shalva is not something that Chazal see in completely unproblematic terms. It was this individual dwelling in shalva, untroubled, serene, that allowed them to say, Bale motolam, I will never fall. And then, of course, they did fall. Right? If Rotarian spoke before about the Greek and the Jewish world, this is what the Greeks called hubris. Right? Pride comes before a fall. Shalva, this pasuk, is the perfect example of hubris, a person seeing themselves completely as the author of their own success, their own fate, not requiring assistance or help of anyone else. And they fell. But Hashem picked them up. Hashem birtzoncha he'emadata l'harei oz. God, it was your will that picked me up, put me upon mountains of strength. Histarta panecha haiti nivhal. If you hide your face, I am confounded. Right? Previously, I didn't need your face at all. I didn't search for you. I felt I was alone and I was happy about it. I was independent. Now, if I feel your absence, I'm terrified. Elecha Hashem ekra ve'el Adonai et chanan. To you I call out. I make my appeal. Ma betza b'dami b'rivati el shachat. What benefit does my blood have if it goes down to the grave? Hayodecha afar. Will the dust acknowledge you? Hayagidamitecha. Will it declare your truth? And by the way, you might have noticed now that the I, the ani, has returned to the verb. Elecha Hashem ekra. To you, Hashem ekra doesn't say ani, correct, because the I is now less standing alone, right? It's now more in relationship with that which is around it. And the rhythm has returned as well. Shama Hashem v'chaneni, Hashem haya ozer li. Hafachta misbedi lamacholi. You turn my lament into dancing, and we're finishing off in similar ways to which we started. Pitachta sakit v'ta'azreini simcha. You take off my sackcloth, you gird me with joy. That my whole being sing hymns to you endlessly. Lord my God, I will praise you forever. It's a beautiful Mizmor, and one which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, not just from Chanuka, but from day-to-day tefillah, from its appearance in Psukei de Zimra. How do we crack it open? How do we get to its meaning, its significance for Chanuka? I want to argue that actually this Mizmor is a coded perush, a commentary on a biblical story with which we are all familiar, and that it references that story and is itself a commentary and an interpretation of that story. And with this, we can begin to crack it open. Anyone pick up on any references within it? Any textual clues that seem to hint at another Tanakh story? Now, I should say, as far as I'm aware, and this is a strange thing, I did not find any reference to this in any midrash, in any perush, and I'm not quite sure what to make of that. But I think there are at least 4 fascinating references to, you might have guessed it, the story of Yosef. This Mizmor references multiple times the story of Yosef. Most obviously, at the start, we had that line, Chayitani miyarde bor. You have given me life from those that went down to the pit. The bor in Tanakh is, of course, associated with Yosef. Yosef is thrown into the pit by his brothers, from where he is sold into slavery. But it's not only that pit, it is also the dungeon in Mitzrayim that he is thrown into, which is referred to as a bor. The bor is number 1. Here is another one. Sheol. Sheol, we mentioned it. You raised me out of the Sheol, the grave or the underworld of my soul. Now, the word Sheol does not appear that much in Tanakh. But when it does appear, more often than not, it is Yaakov who is saying it. And it is Yaakov who is saying it about Yosef, feeling that he will go down to Sheol, mourning for his son. Ered el Sheola, I will go down Sheol, Avel al Beni, mourning for my son. We've got Bor, we've got Sheol. Here is a very powerful one. Pasuk Yud, verse 10. Ma betza bedami beridati el shachat. What benefit to my blood if I go down to the grave? The phrase ma betza, what profit is there, attached to the idea of dam, of blood, appears in only one other story in Tanakh, Perek Lamed Zayin in Bereshit, Parsha Vayeshev, when Yehuda says to his brothers who want to kill Yosef, Vayomer Yehuda elechav ma betza ki naharog et achinu. What benefit do we get from killing our brother? V'chisinu et damo, and covering up his blood. Let's instead sell him. That one to me seems a really, really tight connection. We've got Bor, we've got Sheol, but this is a whole phrase, Ma Betza and Dam, which occurs only in the story of Yosef and in this particular Mizmor. And here's the final one, a really playful one. This one's really genius. Pasuk Yud Bet, verse 12. Hafachta mispedi lemacholi. You turn my lament into comfort. Patacht saki ta'azreini simcha. Pitacht saki, you removed my sackcloth. Sackcloth obviously is clothing to do with mourning, but it's not, if you're more literal, pitachta, you opened up my sackcloth. Next week's parsha, the Mikates, the brothers returning from Yosef. Look over here. V'yiftach ha'echad et sako. One of them opens up his sack. It's not sackcloth, it's sack, as in his bag. And he opens it up. Pitachta saki, pitachti et saki, pitachta saki, v'yiftach ha'echad et sako. To give food to his donkey. And he sees the money that Yosef's servants have stowed in it. Right? That's a really lovely, playful one, that one. 4 tight connections. Bol, Sheol, Mabetza, Patach, et Asak. What's happening here? On the one hand, we've got these basic connections, which seem to say to us, seem to ring a bell for us. Think about the story of Yosef when you are reading this Mizmor. So what's the commentary then? Right, that's the what, the connections, but the why, what does it mean? I want to suggest as follows, that actually our Mizmor, which describes a person who said in their arrogance that they would never fall, and then they fell hard, and they are picked up again, and they realize it is God who has picked them up, is a perfect description of Yosef. Let's think about the story. Right, we read just yesterday. Yosef arrives in Potiphar's house. And I kind of think of this as like, finally he's free. You know, he's been stifled in the backwater in Canaan by the jealousy of his brothers. And he's got nobody there to really actually be of use to him. No audience to impress. And now he arrives in the big city in Mitzrayim. And he is in a house which is very close to the center of Egyptian power. And Potiphar puts him in charge of everything, ki im halechem, except for the bread. And then at this point, I'm on the source at the bottom of the page, Vayihi Yosef yafeh to'ar v'yafeh mareh. Yosef is very beautiful. Handsome appearance. You think to yourself, why are we being told that now? I've known Yosef already for 2 chapters. Why at this point is it introduced to me that he's good looking? So the simple reason is, of course, what follows in the next verse. Potiphar's wife raises her eyes and makes her advances. But Rashi quotes a midrash, and it's a very compelling midrash, which says that the deployment of this detail about Yosef's good looks is not just of reference to what's about to come, it's of reference to what has just happened. It points not only forwards, but also backwards. Vayihi Yosef yafeh to'ar, Rashi, kevan shera'a atzmo moshel. He saw himself becoming powerful. Hitchil ochel v'shoteh u'masalsel b'sa'aro. He ate, he drank, he curled his hair, preening himself. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God says to him, Avicha mitabel, your father is mourning for you. V'ata masalsel b'sa'arecha, and you're curling your hair. You're looking at yourself in the mirror. Ani megareh b'cha et hadov. I'm going to send the bear against you. Meyad v'tisa eshet adonav. Immediately, his master's wife raised her eyes. Yosef in Egypt becomes hugely arrogant, sees himself super powerful, sees himself just ascending the ladder. Ani amarti b'shalvi bal emot olam. I said in my serenity, I would never fall. And he's cast down again. Yosef is cast down not just once, but twice. And even if he hadn't learnt the lesson the first time, he does seem to learn it the second time. During those 2 years in an Egyptian prison, he understands that he is not the sole author of his story. And the great skills and talents that he has are not just his by his own strength and ability. When he interprets the dreams of Paro and of the butler and the baker, Here's one pasuk. Biladi Elokim ya'aneh shalom paro. It's not me, it's Hashem. Hashem gives me this power. When he names his children, he does so now not with himself being the sole character in his story, Ani, but actually with an awareness of how much he has to thank God for it. Menashe, ki nasheni Elohim et kol amali et kol beit avi. God has been the one who has caused me to forget my pain of my father's home. And not only that, he calls the second one Ephraim, ki Ephrani Elohim be'eretz oni. It is God who has made me fruitful, successful in the land of my affliction. It's not simply my own skills, it is Hashem who has given them to me. Yosef was one who was Ani amalti b'shalvi ba'alemot olam, said in his serenity, I will never fall. And having fallen, he says, it is you, Hashem, who has raised me up. You who has picked me up, chayitani miyal devor, given me life from those who have gone down to the pit. And perhaps we can suggest that this is true. This Mizmor makes its point not just about Yosef the individual, but also about Yosef the story. Because what is the point of the Mizmor? That we should not think of our lives as simply being decided by our own human agency. Rather, there is a bigger plan. There is a different plan. There is something behind us which we may only be aware of after the fact. In Parashat Vayigash, when the brothers come down and Yosef reveals himself to them, and he says, Al ta'atzvu, don't be sad, Al yichar beinechem, ki machartem oti heina. Don't think terribly of what you did to me by selling me. Ki lemichya shalchani Elohim lifnechem. It was God who sent me to provide sustenance for the family. He repeats the same idea again 2 verses later. V'ishlacheni Elohim lifnechem. You thought it was you sending me. My father sent me to go and see you shepherding. You sent me down to Egypt. Then your father sent you down to Mitzrayim to get grain. Shalach is what's called a leitvort, a leitmotif of the whole story. Says Yosef that shlichut is taking place by Hashem as well. It is not just human action. Ani amalti b'shalvi ba'alemot olam. You are behind it. And you might have noticed by now, coming towards the end of our time, that Chanuka will always fall during the stories of Yosef. There is a deep connection between the parashiyot of Yosef and the stories of Chanuka. Chanuka will never fall during the stories of Yaakov and Esav. It will never fall during the stories of Shemot. Chanuka is bound to the stories of Yosef. And our Mizmor, which since ancient times, for well over 1,000 years, we have said on Chanuka, clearly is a reference to that idea. And I want to suggest that the message of the Mizmor is also relevant for Chanuka itself. Chanuka has 2 miracles associated with it. It's got the military victory, Rabim biyad ma'atim, Tameim biyad tahorim, Rashaim biyad tzadikim. And it's got the Nespach HaShemen. It's got the little cruse of oil which miraculously burns for so much longer than it was expected to. And you might be familiar with a little bit of the history. Sefer HaMakkabim does not mention the little jar of oil at all. Rather, the astonishing part of the Chanuka story is the military victory. Chazal, by contrast, who remember don't include Sefer HaMakkabim in Tanakh, say, what is Chanuka all about? It's all about the oil and the miracle of the oil. And they barely give any mention to the Nespach HaShemen. By the time you get to the Rambam puts a much greater emphasis on the military victory. And you can sort of play this throughout history, this sort of like tension of what is at the center of the focus of Chanuka. But clearly, I think what Chazal wanted to do by focusing on the Nespach HaShemen was to say, don't think that the military victory which could so easily be explained as kochi v'otzem yadi asali et hachayel hazeh, my strength, my power did this. Don't think that's the case. Not necessarily to play it down, but to understand that behind it is the Nespach Hashemin. Behind whatever success I have, whatever success Yosef has, whatever success we have, we attribute that and in gratitude to Hashem. Yoel introduced me at the start by mentioning the Amital Center. A lot of now is a fascinating time to pick up a very slim book of Rav Amital, which is probably his least known, at least in Haretzion circles. A book called Hama'alot Mima'amakim, The Ascent from the Depths. And it was written in the months after Milchemet Yom Kippurim, 1973 war, trying to make sense of and understand the religious significance of this terrible moment. And people were already interested in it long before October 7th. Tradition published a translation of the first chapter. Yehuda Mersky, who's a great scholar and a student of Rav Amital, wrote a piece on it because 50 years and worth revisiting. But of course now, post October 7th, this book takes on much greater relevance. We're hoping to put on a panel or potentially a series of discussions about the significance of this Sefer for right now. Keep an eye out for it. But there is one chapter in here, in this book, called Ki Dilitani, because you raised me up. Dilitani, obviously from our Mizmor, you raised me up from the pit. And Rav Amital does not give the interpretation on the Mizmor that I gave. What he does rather is he goes back to the beginning of this Mizmor and sees it, I guess, in a sense, through the eyes of national salvation, and notices all of these different phrases that God, you have not let our enemies rejoice over us. God, you have healed us. You've given us life from the grave, what seemed like death. And Rav Amital takes these lines and considers them all in light of the events which they have lived through. Please God, 50 years later, in another very troubling time, may we also merit to say, Arumimcha Hashem ki dilitani v'lo simachto ivaili, not just as the minhag of what we say on Chanuka, but also as a real expression of where we are as a people. Wishing everyone a Chanuka Sameach, wonderful learning with everyone.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Wolfson. I'm going to stop recording. I don't know if